Well, hello, everybody. Um, my name is David Bennett. I'm the curator of maritime history with the North Carolina Maritime Museums, and I wanted to say thank you to you all for coming on out and checking out this presentation, and to everyone online who's also tuned in uh, for this. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is the Stamp Act crisis in North Carolina, which took place in the 1760s, 1765 and 1766. Um, and it's one of the things that wound up leading uh, to the American Revolution eventually. Um, but let's get started. Hey, Christine, this thing. Okay. But before we jump into this, we quickly kind of have to set the scene for what's going on in the world prior to the Stamp Act. So, 1763, the 7 Years' War, which, you know, here in the United States, going through public school system, we've come to know that also as the French and Indian War. But it's the 7 Years' War, and it's a global war. It's arguably the first world war. Um, it went on for 7 years, massive loss of life. But it wrapped up in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. And in the end, Britain was victorious. Um, the French Navy was crippled as a result. Britain gained territory in North America, basically all the territory east of the Mississippi River, and Britain also was able to gain hegemony in India. So, you know, France was still in India, but Britain by large had control of the situation. So this map right here basically shows you what British and sort of Spanish North America look like. So all that's yellow, that's west of the Mississippi, that's Spain. And then these sort of multicolored states, Florida, Georgia, all the way up North Carolina, even the yellow ones, Pennsylvania, um, Maine, those are all, that's all Britain right there, the colonies. So, but the cost of this really long war was a crippling national deficit. Something that we hear about a lot now in the news is the national deficit. Um, but um, but during the war, the national deficit doubled for Britain. And so British mercantilism is economic theory that was going on at the time, and a big part of their economic theory, the way they thought about their finances, was that a big surplus of gold and silver in the government coffers meant strength and national prosperity and power. And a deficit was just the opposite of that. A deficit was just a tragedy. It was disaster. And so the British government was really alarmed. They start slashing government spending, downsizing government, wanting a more efficient government. Sounds familiar. And they decide to heavily regulate their trade as well. Um, at the same time, they're maintaining a massive military presence overseas, especially in the colonies. That increased their military presence abroad to protect the colonies. And this required more money. So here's a table showing the growing British national deficit. And so down here at the very bottom, 7 Years' War, the end debt is 132 million pounds sterling. Um, and then their tax revenue was basically 8.6 million. Um, and so Britain they're like, we have no idea how we're going to pay this off. Um, and so, as I mentioned, at the same time, they're deploying more troops overseas, which is an added expense. They're sending 10,000 British regular troops to be stationed in the colonies to protect against, you still have Spain and you have American Indians, and there's still the French are down in the Caribbean as well as the Spanish and the Dutch, and so there's all these concerns that a war could arise and these colonies would be vulnerable again. At first, the colonists didn't have a problem with this. They're like, okay, fine, more troops. Um, but then they're told that they had to start paying for them, and there's going to be more taxes levied to pay for this military presence. Um, and then that's when they started having a problem with it. And especially North Carolina. North Carolina said, we don't need any troops, any British troops. We have a strong militia. We can stand up for ourselves. We can take care of ourselves, no problem. But of course, Parliament didn't care. And so they come up with this tax called the Sugar Act, which was targeting sugar and molasses coming out of the Caribbean. They're trying to prevent smuggling, and they're trying to give a monopoly to the British sugar producers down in the Caribbean. This isn't a huge problem for North Carolina because, sugar wasn't like a massive, it was part of the trade, but it wasn't a massive part of the trade like it was for New England. However, there was a provision in the Sugar Act that was regulating the lumber trade, which was a big part of North Carolina's industry. And lumber became an enumerated commodity under the Navigation Act because of this law. So basically what had to happen was all the lumber that was going to be exported from North Carolina had to first go through either England or an English colony, which was really going to slow things down. Really, ultimately, it's going to have to go through England. Then the Vice Admiralty Court at Halifax, Nova Scotia, was created. Now, there's Vice Admiralty courts all throughout the American colonies. North Carolina had several of them that was there to regulate maritime law. Now, there's this trade in sugar and molasses that's not going to be regulated by these admiralty courts, but they've made this separate one up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So if you get in trouble, if you violate this law, they can send you all the way up there. And so people didn't like that either. But it's not intensely protest against North Carolina. And in 1766, they wound up dropping the taxes down. They back off. Now, a big problem in North Carolina, which will lead up to the Stamp Act, is the Currency Act of 1764. Now, throughout the colonies, and especially in North Carolina, there's a chronic shortage of gold and silver. And so to address this problem, the colonial governments were printing paper money. And North Carolina was printing a lot of paper money, and it was heavily deflated, it's heavily inflated. It is constantly losing value. And a lot of these British merchants in London who were doing trade with North Carolina and other colonies, like Virginia also had a big problem with their colonial currency. They didn't like this because they're potentially going to lose money on business transactions. And so they get Parliament to pass a law that essentially bans the printing of paper money. And so you have to rely on gold and silver, something that most North Carolinians don't have access to. So it puts North Carolina in financial distress. There's counterfeiting, people are flipping coins, there's mobs and riots that are going on. It's pretty messy in 1764. Then 1765, we get the Stamp Act. So this law was passed by Parliament on March 22nd, 1765, but it's going to take effect November 1st. So this is the first really direct tax, though. Everything else was sort of an indirect tax, but this is the first direct tax. And how they're going to do it was they're going to tax paper. So anything sort of playing cards, pamphlets, newspapers, almanacs, books, legal documents such as contracts, deeds, wills, um, ship clearances, papers for vessels to come in and out of ports. All that paper is going to be taxed. And you had to pay the tax in gold or silver, something that most colonists had a trouble acquiring. Um, and violations of this was going to be sent to the Vice Admiralty courts. And the Vice Admiralty courts are not a trial by jury, they're a trial by judge. So you have one person deciding your fate if you get in trouble. So the view, the perspective of the colonists was that this is a travesty. That they said we're fine with the Navigation Acts, we're fine with indirect taxation, we're fine with our maritime trade being regulated and taxed, because that's really all about the whole mercantilist theory, where basically it's protectionist trade policy and cutting down smuggling and all that kind of stuff. Like, we don't have a huge problem with it. But they're like, we have a big problem with Parliament taxing us when we don't have any direct representation in Parliament abroad. And they're taxing us to raise money for something that we don't feel like we even need. We don't feel like we need this military presence in the colonies. And they're also really worried about potentially being sent to Halifax, Nova Scotia, because this falls under Vice Admiralty Court jurisdiction. So in Boston, in August of 1765, you have some pretty violent protests that go on up there. Then in October, protests start up in North Carolina, and they start up down in Brunswick and Wilmington, the lower Cape Fear area. In Wilmington, you have 500 people get together at 7 o'clock in the evening, and they make this effigy. So it's like almost like a mannequin, or a representation of a person that is supposed to symbolize someone who spoke in favor of the Stamp Act. And they hung that effigy by a noose, and they made all these bonfires out of burning tar barrels. And later on, they burned the effigy as well in protest. And then these protesters, these 500 people, they start going door to door to their neighbors who haven't shown up yet and said, you better come out and protest with us, or something might happen to you. And so they get the whole town of Wilmington to come out to a protest. And people start drinking and toasting to liberty, property, and no stamp duty or no stamp tax. And each time they have a toast, they have their huzzah, so they're shouting out and stuff, and they're partying and drinking till midnight, and they all peacefully go home. And then October 31st, 1765, the night before the Stamp Act is supposed to take effect, there's another protest in Wilmington. So this is Wilmington, this pretty small town by today's standards, back in 1765. But anyways, so they have this huge funeral pageant where, again, they create an effigy, but this time, this effigy is supposed to represent liberty. And so they have liberty in a coffin that they carry throughout the streets of Wilmington. And then eventually they wind up in the churchyard and they dig a grave for liberty. But before they go to bury liberty, they check her pulse. And they say, oh, we found a pulse. Liberty is still alive in North America. And so they decide to have a huge party in the graveyard with bonfires, and they take an armchair and they put it in front of the bonfire and they set liberty in front of it, and they just party and drink the whole night in the graveyard. Pretty creative protests back then. So November 1st, the next day, the Stamp Act finally takes effect. But there's a problem, because the the stamps didn't arrive on time. There's no stamps yet in North Carolina. And on top of that, nobody knows who is supposed to be in charge of distributing the stamps. Um, and so Governor Tryon, who is brand new, he's brand new on the scene, and he's living down in the Wilmington area at this time. He just sort of taken office. His response is life is in North Carolina is just going to have to stand still for a while until this whole Stamp Act thing can be sorted out. So, in other words, there's no newspapers are going to be published. No court is going to be held until there's stamps because they can't authenticate their legal documents without these stamps. All the ports are going to be closed because there's not going to be any way to authenticate these custom papers and ship clearance papers. And so all the ships are just going to have to hang out, and basically nothing happens. And Brunswick, which is just down the river, it's really close to where Southport is today. Basically, there's just a ruins of a town there. Brunswick, North Carolina, was the top port for North Carolina. It was the only really deep water port in North Carolina. It had the majority of North Carolina's transatlantic trade was in and out of that port, and it was also sort of the capital of the naval stores trade, tar, pitch, turpentine. The majority of those commodities, as well as lumber, was going in and out of that port. And so you've got just barrels of turpentine and tar are just piling up on the docks with nowhere to go. Then finally, they find out who's supposed to be in charge of issuing stamps. There's this man, Dr. William Houston, had been appointed to the position, or the folks in London decided to appoint him to the position in July, but they didn't receive word until mid-November that this is going to be the guy. And so on November 16th, or around November 15th, I think, he kind of found out that he was going to be a stamp distributor. So the next day, he gets on his horse and he's headed to Wilmington, and he's greeted by a crowd of hundreds of people are waiting for him, and they're telling him, "You're not going to take this job, and if you do, we're gonna mess you up. There's going to be bodily harm involved. They're probably going to tar and feather him." And so he is right there on the spot, forced to write a letter of resignation and sign it in front of this entire crowd of people. And so once he accomplishes that, then people decide it's time to party again. And so they put him in an armchair and lift him up, and they carry him around the courthouse in Wilmington. And each time they're around the corner, they start shouting huzzahs. And then after they're done with parading around the courthouse, they then take him to a local pub or bar, and they get him liquored up on the best liquor that the bar had to offer. And people just continued. They made another bonfire that evening, and they partied through the whole evening. And it's a big protest, basically, but they're having a good time with it. This is a copy of his letter of resignation. Anyways, these protests that are originating in Wilmington, they're spreading throughout North Carolina, and New Bern, the whole protest, Cross Creek, which is a very small community, which is basically today Fayetteville. They have protests there. Duplin County, the home of Dr. Houston, they're protesting him back at home. And so things are getting, pretty tense in North Carolina. Then after this whole thing is resolved with Dr. Houston, the crowd then turns on the local newspaper, the North Carolina Gazette. And the publisher says, "Sorry, folks, I can't publish the newspaper without stamps. It's against the law." And they tell him, like, "You're going to start publishing and distributing newspapers again, or we're going to come and inflict potentially bodily harm on you or your property. Yes, ma'am. No. Dr. Houston was not harmed at all. He's just the opposite. He was celebrated for resigning because he did exactly what the mob told him to do. Um, oh, yeah, sorry, this is effigy. It was an effigy of him. His effigy was being hanged elsewhere. Sorry about that. I guess other word had gone out to other communities that he had stepped down. Um, but um, uh, but anyways, so they forced the publisher um, to start printing the newspaper again, and his response is that rather than run the hazard of life being maimed or have his printing office destroyed, that he would comply with their request. So he didn't want to have his print house burned down, and he didn't want to be tarred and feathered or beaten. Um, and what's kind of interesting is that when they put the first issue back into circulation, down there on the right hand corner, there's a skull and crossbones, and it says to affix your stamp here. So it's another form of protest. But really, they need to have these newspapers back up so they can start disseminating information about their opposition and their resistance to the British government and to the Stamp Act. So that's one of the reasons why they would need this newspaper back up and running. So November 28th, finally the stamps arrive, and they arrive on the British warship HMS Diligence, comes and pulls into the Cape Fear River over by Port Brunswick. And you have a group of men who are led by Hugh Waddle, John Ash, and they've got a whole bunch of armed men with them. And they go to the port and they tell the captain, you can't land these stamps, or if you try to, there's going to be trouble. And so the stamps naturally remained on HMS Diligence. Nothing happened. And Governor Tryon, surprisingly, did not report this incident to London. This was an act of treason, and there were no consequences for this behavior. And probably because Governor Tryon was brand new in the colony, and he didn't want to report back to the colonial office in London that he couldn't handle the situation in North Carolina, because that would have made him look bad. As I mentioned earlier, everything kind of ground to a halt in North Carolina without the stamps. So there's no mail is going out because there's no stamps. There's no building, all the building projects are put on hold. So if you're in the middle of building something or you're about to start building something, that's all placed on hold. Government salaries, government employees were not getting paid because there was no stamps. Weddings were postponed because you couldn't go get a marriage license authenticated. Lawsuits were placed on hold. Debts went uncollected. Contracts were delayed. Ships were stuck in port. Things were just an absolute mess in North Carolina, and people are losing money over this. And so Governor Tryon steps up and he says, I'll pay for some of these stamps, especially to get the courts back up and running and to make sure that marriages happen and contracts are executed, and all these sort of things that go into making the court system and the ports work. And he said, I'll even throw on some wine licenses for various towns throughout North Carolina. And so he's trying to bribe the colonists into accepting the Stamp Act. And their response is, no, we're not going to accept your bribe. We're not going to accept this law. And so next you have the governor's speech, in December of 1765. And so, as I mentioned, Governor Tryon is new on the scene in North Carolina. He has taken office, but he hasn't performed some of the ceremonial duties of the office yet. So they haven't had an official reading of his royal commission to be governor, and he hasn't yet made his inaugural address as governor of North Carolina. But this is his opportunity on December 20th, in the middle of a crisis. He's going to try and do this. And so they're on the waterfront in Wilmington where he makes this address. And everything is geared up for afterwards. I have a huge party, by the way. And so he gives his speech, and where he encourages North Carolinians to cooperate with the Stamp Act, and he again offers to pay some of the fees on the stamps himself, and to even turn down money that's owed to him and his office. And the crowd booed him, opposite of what he was expecting. And there's a merchant ship that was in the harbor that raised the Irish flag in response. And this was in violation of British law. I mean, Ireland's a British colonial possession as well. It's part of, the UK, but it was, it was just, and so this is the British flag of the 17th, 18th century. The modern day British flag that we know today was created in the 1920s. But anyways, so this flag goes up, and there's a confrontation because you've got Captain Phipps of HMS Diligence sees this as an affront to British imperial rule, and he sends some men to go seize that flag, take it down. And so the sailors in town, that's something I sort of neglected to mention, that a lot of these protests that are going on in Wilmington are being instigated by mariners because all these ships are sitting idle in port and they can't go anywhere, and people are losing money. And the sailors and captains are really angered by this. But so the sailors, townspeople, and the local militia even are get really upset with Phipps. And so he's staying in like a tavern in town, and they decide to go surround the building. So there's this angry mob surrounding a building where there's a British naval officer staying, and they go down to the waterfront and they steal the ship's boat, and they drag it through the streets of Wilmington, up and down all the streets. And finally they bring his boat and put it right under his window, and the whole crowd is just screaming insults at his window. And then so Governor Tryon gets involved, and he's trying to quell this mob. And he said, "Hey, why don't y'all take some barrels of punch?" Which is just it's alcohol. He's trying to bribe the crowd to calm down, disperse by throwing alcohol into the mix. And so they reject his peace offering. And so there's this letter here, a quote from this letter. They then launched the boat into the water. So they put the captain's boat back in the water, and collected themselves around an ox and 6 or 7 barrels of punch. So there's an ox that had been killed, and this ox had been prepared for the crowd to consume after the governor was supposed to have given his inaugural speech. Kind of like, instead of having a pig picking, they had an ox picking is what it was going to be, kind of. But so around an ox and 6 or 7 barrels of punch, which had been given by His Excellency, they immediately broke in the heads of the barrels of punch and let run into the street. But the head of the ox in the pillory, and gave the carcass to the Negroes. This was what the governor's vanity could by no means brook, in such that when the corporation of Wilmington offered to address him in order to exculpate themselves, he refused to see their recorder or hear their address. And it said he determined to leave that place and settled at Newbern. So basically what happened was he offered them food and drink as a peace offering. they broke the barrels, poured the alcohol down the street, chopped the head off the ox, put it in a pillory where you would put sort of criminals, and they gave the rest of it to slaves, or enslaved people. And there's another account that talks about this that said that even the enslaved people of Wilmington would not take this. And so when the local government comes around and tries to apologize, the governor said, no, no, I've had enough of you people here in Wilmington. I'm going to Newbern. And what we have today, we've got Tryon Palace is in Newbern, not in Wilmington. But in January 1766, this is where things start to really heat up and get out of hand. So you have two sloops, which this is what a sloop looks like. Patience and Dobbs, they sail into Brunswick, and they are immediately seized. One of them had come from Philadelphia, the other one had come from the West Indies, and neither one of them had stamped papers from those ports. And so they were seized, and they're in violation of the Stamp Act, and they've been taken by HMS Viper, another British warship. And so William Dry, the customs collector, was forced to libel or bring charges against those vessels under the Stamp Act. Then shortly thereafter, another sloop comes into Brunswick, and it too is seized. That sloop's the Ruby. And so the customs collector, who is a local to the area, he's very sympathetic with the plight of his fellow colonists. He takes some legal questions to the Attorney General of North Carolina about the situation. And this is the Attorney General, Robert Jones Jr. And he says, is failing to obtain clearances, etc., on stamped paper a proper cause for seizing the said vessels, and to be considered as a neglect of the duties required by the acts of trade sufficient to induce a court of admiralty to decree vessels and cargoes forfeited? So he said, he's basically saying, do we really have to do this? And he's told that clearance papers, the Attorney General's response, clearance papers are legal documents that must be stamped. So no exception. He says, if vessels sailed without stamped clearance papers, they are liable to be seized and condemned by a Vice Admiralty Court. So there's no exceptions that are being shown for these vessels. So question number 2, this is Robert Jones's coat of arms. Upon proof being made that it was impossible to obtain clearances on stamped paper of the officers of the customs and the ports from whence the said vessels sailed, will it not be sufficient cause to induce the court to decree a favor of the owner of the said vessels? So basically, these ports aren't, these, Philadelphia and the West Indies ports, they're not stamping paper. So it seems like, the courts will dismiss this, right? Do we really have to do this? And the Attorney General said the captains were negligent. He said they should have demanded the proper clearances from the customs officials in places like Philadelphia. And he said when those customs officials refused to stamp their clearance papers, they should have documented their protest with the local court's notary, so that basically they would have had to written up an affidavit and had it notarized by the local court saying that the customs official wasn't going to be stamping their papers, so they could then present it at the next port. And because those captains didn't think to do it, then they're negligent and in violation of the law. And so question number 3, which is the last one, if it is necessary to prosecute on Captain Love's information, must the prosecution be commenced in the Court of Admiralty at Cape Fear or must the said vessels be sent to Halifax in order to be libeled? So, and the Attorney General said, send them to Nova Scotia because we don't have any stamps to authenticate legal documents for our local Vice Admiralty courts. And so basically they're going to have to send these vessels all the way up the coast, far away, to go to court. And so the reaction of the locals, Hewlett and others, that they send a letter to the customs collector, William Dry, and they say this day was received the copy of the Attorney General's answer to the queries and of his letter relative to the vessels seized by Captain Loeb. There were many of the country gentlemen in town this morning who are since gone away very much dissatisfied on the matter, and it is certain that in a few days the news will spread through several of the counties. We are apprehensive of the very ill consequences that will attend this affair should you suffer these vessels or the papers belonging to them to be carried out of the river. If the people of the country come down in a body, which we are informed they are determined to do, we leave you to judge how far our properties or yours may be secure. We mention these matters to you as friends of our country ourselves. So they're saying, if you proceed with this course of action of sending these vessels to Halifax, Nova Scotia, a mob is going to come down to Wilmington and Brunswick. Your house might get burned, and some bad stuff might happen to you if you decide to keep proceeding. And so William Dry, the next day, he writes a letter to this mob that's forming, and he says, "You must all," and he's sympathetic to them. And he's like, "You must all know that I'm obliged to receive those vessels into my hands, and that I am further obliged to prosecute on behalf of the crown. I hope, gentlemen, you don't take this amiss of me by doing my duty, for if I was to give up my office, another would immediately appointed in my place, who perhaps may be more strict than ever I was. The vessels are delivered to me with all the papers which I now have, and you may rest assured that neither the vessels nor papers shall be taken from this unless by force, which I hope you will never be the case, as I am well assured Captain Loeb does not desire or intend any such thing. I expect to be at Wilmington tomorrow or next day, when I hope to have it in my power to satisfy you." He's saying, I'm just doing my job. I don't really want to do this. The only way, all the papers are with me. The only way anyone's going to get them is by force. And by the way, I'm going to be in my office for the next few days in Wilmington. Kind of wink, wink. And so you've got all these vessels that are hearing about what's going on in North Carolina, and they're turning away. They're not going into the Cape Fear River. They're not going to Brunswick or Wilmington. And because they're hearing that the Stamp Act is actually being enforced in North Carolina, and it's not being enforced elsewhere in the colonies. The Port of Brunswick is basically the only port that is still shut down to trade in North America because of the Stamp Act. Everywhere else, they've protested, they've rejected the Stamp Act, but life is proceeding as normal in those places. North Carolina is the exception. And that's one of the reasons why it's worth talking about, because North Carolina is the exception to what's going on elsewhere. And so anger is rising throughout the colony because people, like I've mentioned, people are losing money on, so much of North Carolina is dependent on maritime trade. All these naval stores, the tar pitch turpentine, the lumber, all these things. This is the cornerstone of the North Carolina colonial economy. North Carolinians are called Tar Heels because of the naval store industry. And so you have a bunch of angry Tar Heels. And so in February 19th, you have the Sons of Liberty organized in North Carolina. And they basically, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but basically they're saying in this letter, they're saying that we respect the king, but our beef is with Parliament. And we will, we hate protest, we hate rebellion, but we're going to do what we have to do to stand up for ourselves. And this is broadcasted throughout the colonies. And so on February 19th, you have 1,000 armed men gather and they march on the port of Brunswick. And they're from all the neighboring counties in the area. And first they stop off at Governor Tryon's house because they want to give him the courtesy of knowing that there's a rebellion that's going to be descending on Brunswick, and that they're going to tell him his intentions and stuff. And really, who they're looking for is Captain Lobb. They want to find him and air out their grievances with him. And but they have the governor's house surrounded. They're trying to get Governor Tryon to tell them where the captain is. He won't say anything, and then basically, sort of, they find out while they're waiting there that the captain is on HMS Viper, which is off of Brunswick, and so they all continue on their way. But they leave a contingent of men to guard Governor Tryon's house and basically put him under house arrest. And so that same day they catch up with HMS Viper and they demand a meeting with Captain Lobb for him to release those sloops that he had seized. And they're delayed talking to him, and while they're delayed talking to him, they get really upset, and so they send a mob that same day to William Dry's office in Wilmington to go seize the ship papers. So the sloop Dobbs was already gone. It was already released on bond. The papers of Patience and Ruby were still with William Dry, and they're taken by force, according to William Dry. And he said, there's a lot of people who stormed my office, and I can't say for sure who took my papers. He said, I didn't see which ones actually broke my desk open and stole everything. Governor Tryon, he's like, this guy is an idiot. He's like, I told him to put those papers on either HMS Diligence or Viper. He didn't do it. There's good reason he didn't do it, because William Dry is sympathetic with the locals. So later on, the next day, there's a meeting that's held aboard Diligence, and it's Captain Lobb, Captain Phipps, the local Vice Admiralty Judge McGuire, and William Dry, the collector, and Governor Tryon. And there's this armed crowd waiting for them on shore. They're like, we need to get them an answer. And they're like, okay, we're going to release Ruby, that sloop. And they're like, that one, we're not even sure if we have like a strong case against that vessel to even hold that one. And but they didn't really want to release Patience. And the Dobbs, as I mentioned, was already, gone, had been released under bond. And so, the decision was basically that they're going to release Ruby, but not Patience. And then at the same time, Governor Tryon is ordering the defense of Fort Johnston, and he's tells Viper and Diligence to go there to cover the fort. So Fort Johnston is basically where Southport is today. It's at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. If you ever go to the North Carolina Maritime Museum at Southport, you're basically at Fort Johnston. So the fort's defenses, they've got a lot of guns ready to go, but they don't have enough men to even operate the weapons. They only got 5 soldiers, and there's this huge armed crowd just up the river, and things are going on. There's not enough communication, and people start panicking, and they start spiking the guns to make them inoperable at the fort because they're like, we won't be able to hold the fort against 1,000. 5 against 1,000 is just not going to happen. And then, so Captain Laud actually has a change of heart that he does not discuss with Governor Tryon, and he's like, well, I'm just going to release all the vessels. And I'm going to completely capitulate to this local uprising. And so the final blow to all this is like, okay, it wasn't enough to get these vessels released. Now they have to get all of the government officials to agree not to enforce the Stamp Act. And so you've got this crowd of 1,000 armed men. They go and they basically round up these government officials and tell them to renounce the Stamp Act and to promise that they're never going to enforce it. And they get everyone to do it, except the comptroller for the port is missing, and he is hiding out at Governor Tryon's house. And so the crowd, they go back to Tryon's house and surround it, and they demand to see the comptroller. And this time they're really angry. They're like, if you don't send this man out, some violent action is going to take place. And the comptroller agreed against Governor Tryon's wishes to meet with the crowd, and he gave his resignation to Tryon, however, before he went out to the crowd. So it was kind of a meaningless capitulation because he had just resigned. He just quit his job. So the customs collector, the naval officer, the comptroller of Port Brunswick, they're all surrounded, and they give their pledges not to issue any stamped paper, and they gathered all the court clerks and lawyers and made them do the same thing, and then commerce resumed. And because Governor Tryon, he just gave up. He said, I'm just going to go with it. And business went back to usual. The port opened back up, trade resumed, and life kind of went back to normal. Not long after, so this is all in like February. By March, the Stamp Act is repealed. It's not even, up for a year. Hasn't even, been enforceable for a year, and it's already repealed. And so some things are going on. There's all these revolutionary ideals that are flowing on around about the colony's relationship to Parliament, and so this no taxation without representation. And the colonists are claiming that Parliament did not have jurisdiction over the colonies because they have a royal charter. There are royal colonies that only the king should have dominion over the colonies. And they're constantly citing, our problem isn't with the king, it's with Parliament. And under this royal charter, we are allowed to set up our own governments, our own General Assembly. And so Parliament really needs to have the consent of the people to issue a direct tax. So that's the colonists' idea coming out of all this. And then the British Parliament, however, they did not want to capitulate. They did not want to repeal the Stamp Act because they thought this was going to set a bad precedent. That this is just, in the future, this is going to lay the pavement for more rebellion and opposition in the future. And the Parliament said, we don't understand the colonial perspective. They said, this is a weird interpretation of the British Constitution. To them, very few people, most people in the British Isles did not have direct representation. The Parliament believed in virtual representation, So basically a small number of people just represented everyone, and were kind of trusted to do everything in everyone's behalf and interest. Um, they weren't really interested in this idea of this direct representation. Basically, the people who represent directly were large landowners, wealthy people. Um, so, and also Parliament cites that the 7 Years' War was largely fought to preserve the colonies and the colonists, and um, so the colonists seem to be sort of ungrateful for all this. Um, However, the big reasons why Stamp Act was repealed wasn't because of the rebelliousness in the colonies. It was because the British were losing money. At the end of the day, it all came down to money. Um, all this upheaval in the colonies, all these protests, is bad for business. Um, and while all these ports had been shut down and there wasn't as much trade going on, and the colonists are refusing to um, you know consume British goods, trade is on the decline with Britain, and because of all um, this drop in business due to the Stamp Act, 10,000 workers in England lost their jobs. And so Parliament is inundated with angry petitions from English workers and businessmen saying how they lost their jobs, they're going to lose their home, they're losing their businesses, all because of this silly little dispute in the colonies. And so at the same time, the colonists started developing their own industrial capacities. Uh, uh, for instance, one of the things you had in North Carolina was textiles. People started establishing their own textile looms, so they wouldn't have to bother with British textiles. That was like one of the big um, uh, um, imports into the colonies was British cloth. Um, and so, the Stamp Act is repealed. However, not long after that, you have the Declaratory Act, which basically says, Parliament is supreme, and North Carolinians are like, sure, whatever, and they just ignore that. And they ignore Parliament. But the colonists are happy that life has kind of gone back to normal in North Carolina, and they give a and they're happy that Governor Tryon went along with their demands, and so they decide to pay for Tryon Palace, which was built in New Bern and not down in Wilmington, where you know Governor Tryon was initially interested in settling, because Wilmington, Port Brunswick, that was the center of maritime trade and the transit, especially the transatlantic trade. Um, and so but after that, beyond 1766, going more towards 1775, you have just increased resistance to British trade laws, as predicted by Parliament when they were repealing the Stamp Act. And so the long-term consequences um, of this capitulation by the British government to the Stamp Act is that there's this revolutionary ideology that's developing in places like North Carolina and other colonies. People are storing up and reciting all their grievances against Parliament. They're learning how to organize themselves um, into resistance against the government. Um, and they're spreading ideas around the colonies about how they can resist. Um, and there's enhanced communications. They're developing their own, these colonists are developing their own political sort of communications networks, where they're sharing their ideas, they're sharing their grievances, and their ideas of eventual independence as well. And so thanks for hanging in there with me, guys. That's all I've got for y'all today. Do y'all have any questions about this presentation? Yes, sir.
Since the Stamp Act was to pay for protection, I'm inferring that there were troops in the colony.
Yes.
Well, why would they come to enforce the Stamp Act where thousands of on put in that
think there is as many troops stationed in North Carolina at this time to really quell this thing. As I said, there's only like 5 soldiers down at Fort Johnston at this time, and then you just have the Navy, which is stuck on board their vessels in the Cape Fear River, and uh, so I think more of the concern was going to be more around the frontier areas where you're more likely to have incursions from other European, uh, Europeans are on the borders. And then there's and North Carolina also wasn't like the biggest economic producer in terms of the colonies either, but so there probably would have been less emphasis placed on protection here. Any other questions? Okay, well, if not, thank you all for showing up for this presentation. Christine.
Those are the ones right now. The remainder of the presentation I have is